I'm Caitlin, one of the admins at Locally Optimistic, and wrote this pair of articles recently with Alexis because, I don't know, it's probably almost a year ago, she threw out this phrase, linear and circular projects, and it was just so helpful in kind of capturing this very unique attribute of working in data. And I kept kind of pulling it out occasionally, and every time I sort of explained what it captured, there was someone in the room who was like, that, I needed that phrase in my life. So we set out to kind of capture what that would look like. And Alexis, I will let you intro yourself.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll do a better job than the last time I co-hosted. My name is Alexis. I am an engagement manager at a consulting firm called Brooklyn Data Co. And so I've seen these different types of projects in play in a lot of places. And as a part of getting ready to be a manager, I was talking to a lot of people about linear and circular projects and kind of got some of those reactions that Caitlin talked about. And so it was really exciting when we were able to coordinate to put together this set of articles for you all. You want to talk about just a quick overview of the difference between linear and circular projects? Talk about why you like it?
Sure.
Or do we do all around intros? I don't know how it normally goes.
Sometimes we do all around intros, but to be honest, we rarely have this many people. So I'm going to say our great attendance is sufficient to cut people off and maybe not give them a minute. But
okay.
When you pipe up, introduce yourself, let us know who you are, and I think that will be maybe an easier way to do it than the round robins.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the basics of kind of what is linear and circular in this context, we broke out projects into these categories based on kind of how well you can actually project success, which is not to say that one is easier or harder than the other, but it's really a measure of unknowns. So in a linear project, you know that there is a path to your destination and that with enough work, it will be effective. And you can certainly break that down into milestones and smaller pieces of the project. And the more time that you spend planning, the better job you can do projecting how long that project will take and what your roadblocks are going to be. And it really looks a little bit more like traditional engineering scoping. Like, I can break this down into small enough stories that we know we can get through this and we will get to the outcome that we're looking for. A circular project, on the other hand, in doing the project, you learn something that informs the feasibility of the project. And so that's really common in data because so much of what we do depends on what the data actually is. And that is both unknown at the outset and ever changing, which adds kind of another level of complexity on top of it. But, you know, you can be given a question. Someone wants to know why this metric changed. Why is conversion going up? And you can outline some paths to go down. You can go down those paths and they may or may not hold an actual answer to the question. And so that may open different paths. Well, it wasn't these three things. So next I can look at these three things. And you can go off and do that work. And you could ultimately find out that you don't have the data to know why it is increasing. You may be able to rule out a lot of hypotheses, but you can't actually confirm what changed. Or you can build a model and it's not actually predictive. And so there's a real difference between being able to take a very large project and break it down into definitively achievable tasks versus taking a large project and breaking it down into tasks that you can achieve that may or may not actually ladder back to your goal. And when you get into those circular projects where you have to get into the project to know whether or not the next stage is viable, it adds a whole different level of communication with stakeholders and just understanding of what data work is. And I think Alexis and I really kind of wrote this specifically to help you communicate in a way that helps other people who aren't doing this work on a daily basis understand why it's different and why you aren't like the engineering team that can really effectively break things down into small stories, understand exactly what your velocity is, and make it through the project.
Yeah, I don't think I can make any better of a nutshell than that. I love the framework because it gets at those, like I always think of the secret failures in data or those opaque ones, which are always around building trust, communication, really those two things. Everything kind of comes down to that. And so I think that's one of those ways to help improve transparency or set expectations, which is why having this, it's just like an extra piece in your project management tool belt. But I find it to be a really helpful way to think about projects that goes beyond like, oh, I just know this from experience, right? So it's kind of pulling back that layer a little bit. We picked up first discussion question. I mean, we can start anywhere if other people have particular comments, but would love to hear what you think about that concept, how that might have come into play in your work, anything like that.
Yeah, I'll say that I sit in an engineering org, and this is something that I have long struggled with my team, is like, especially because some of the work that we do, stuff like ETL, tends to seem very engineering-like. So when an analysis does not have like a clear timeline, it's something that has been a source of a lot of confusion and grief. So having the concept of a circular workflow has been helpful to me personally, but it's also something that like when like the second part of this article came out, I sent it to people on my team. And they were like, this is so helpful. This explains so much what I need to be doing to work with my stakeholders. So I do think this concept is capturing something that's very real and has eluded a lot of people for a long time. Yeah, I was supposed to introduce myself. You can see from my Zoom name that I'm Katie Bauer. I'm a data science manager at Reddit.
Should we go next?
Go for it.
Hi, I'm Harlan. I manage data science at Teachers Pay Teachers. I was thinking about, so I really like this framework, and I was thinking about it kind of in the maybe the other way around today while having a conversation with one of the junior data scientists on my team. And she recently moved from a team where she was doing primarily linear work. So, analyze this A/B test, build this predictive model where there is some circularity, but we were pretty sure we could get something, off the bat. To, her current question is, we run a two-sided marketplace, and we have this like new feature that we've launched. And so she was asked like, what are good items, or what are items that are good for this new feature? And that's not just a circular problem, right? It's like, I don't even know what good means in this context, right? Like, is there one answer? Are there 5 answers? And so particularly for her, it was really, talking about circular projects and like replanning, and that what you should be doing is trying to figure out what the question is right now, not trying to figure out what the answer is. I think, at least I'm hoping that was good guidance for her, that it allows her to like step back and say, okay, my goal is to really understand the question well enough to identify what type of solution I want to get to, whether that's, a report or a predictive model or something else, or throw it away and work on something else. So I think that there's value, particularly for people who are newer to this work, in this distinction as well.
That's super important. Like I said, that feels like that secret thing that you figure out with experience. So kind of figuring out how to bring up less experienced folks, like in that particular framework. Yeah, that's secret sauce right there.
The point about this being especially helpful for people who are newer to the field, I think, is pretty interesting, because something I notice with more junior analysts and data science folks is that they're frustrated that their stakeholder doesn't like literally ask them what they want for. Like they just want to have like an end-to-end linear, like, oh, they want me to tell, or they want to be told, like, build a regression model in this case. And helping them understand that they have to iterate to actually get to the end product is a good way to get them started on the right foot.
Yeah, and I think that's another really great example of just how this work is different from engineering. Like the more junior the engineer, the clearer the specs handed to them. And the more they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Whereas it's just not how data works. Like even at a very junior level, you just have to be able to ask those questions and draw out what's the business context, what's the actual goal, what do you really mean when you say this word, what does that mean to you, which might be different than what it means to us. And kind of dealing with all of that ambiguity happens so much sooner.
And talk with your manager if you're, more junior.
Yes, I every now and then I teach a class on data in the wild, which is all the stuff that has nothing to do with actually, making the model. It's all about communication and that sort of thing. And there's a lot on, there's so much outside of linear and circular projects, but that like it's nice to think about them all in comparison, because yes, requirements gathering, distinguishing between needs and requests, like this doesn't work if you're not doing that good work on the front end either, or asking, what business question does this ladder back up to? But it's nice to have in parallel. That matches up with one of the other sort of starter questions we thought about as well. Are there any other strategies that you think pair well with this, or other frameworks that you use to think about project management that are worth, that you want to share with the group?
I'll kind of jump in there too. I'm Brad Colbert, Director of Data Engineering and Analytics at Outdoor Voices in Austin, Texas, where it's hot. But this has all been really timely because kind of like Katie was saying about her team, we are an engineering team within an engineering org. And as an engineering organization, we're also going through a cycle right now of getting stricter and tighter on our Agile framework and our deliverables, and really tight sprint planning. And when I'm sitting here thinking about these two kinds of work, like this whole framework has given me a really good vocabulary for fitting both kinds of projects, both the linear and the circular, into a sprint delivery cycle with fixed points. So I would be curious to hear if anybody else is working in an Agile framework as well and trying to fit these in. What I'm tentatively working with, and again, we're about a week into this, so haven't even wrapped up a sprint this way, but we're also kind of leveraging the idea of spikes within a sprint. So kind of the non-deliverable, seeing a lot of nodding heads, but carving out like a time boxed period for an engineer to do work that doesn't have a code deliverable necessarily tied to it, but will be more exploratory and kind of figuring out what needs to come next as part of the sprint cycle. And so we're trying to time box as much as we can this circular work to say like, okay, this cycle, this round of the circle is, we're giving it a couple days. And then we'll regroup and we'll see where we're at and see which new threads we can prioritize and where we go from there. But yeah, that's where my head's at with all of this right now.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're thinking of that. I guess I don't know what work specifically is being billed as a spike, but I also am operating in sprints and Agile. And the way that my team's been thinking about it is like, there's time boxed periods to like answer specific questions, and then the deliverable is the thing that's presented for feedback. So in the same way in traditional Agile that you might like build a product and then release it to customers to see how they use it and do analytics on whatever they're doing, get feedback that way. We have sort of like a minimum viable insight or minimum viable analysis that it's like we share it, we get feedback, and we figure out, is this sufficient or do we need to go further once we've done that? And it can be really easy for that to get out of hand, of course, but that's when you put your foot down and say, like, is this actually, like, what are we going to do with this information once we have it? Will this do anything? Is this a curiosity or is this a must-have, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, you can control time or you can control scope. And if you go just for scope, then anything could happen. And you have to be really tight about getting those vertical slices. Like, I've been doing work, here's a table that shows, what came out of it. Because some things you just have to see how they get there. But a lot of times, yeah, I'm always coaching people, I keep a notepad on my desk. I'm like, if it seems really like, this might be a bug, or I really want to know about that, but I'm supposed to do this, I keep it on my desk. I coach my folks to keep it on their desk, because the potential rabbit holes, they're so tempting. And you do have to get to that minimum viable piece. So that's awesome. Without getting trapped by a bug that you need to pass on to engineering or something.
I can add that we've been using agile processes. Hi, my name is Samuel. I'm the head of data science at Amplify, a K-8 education company. And, we have a couple of team members who run on 2-week sprints, and one team member who prefers to manage their workflow on a more like a Kanban style. And this sort of issue of circular versus linear workflows really has been rearing its head up lately for us in the domain of estimation and trying to size our tickets. And especially the person who's been running more on Kanban tickets has been struggling with spin out a bit and estimation. And, one thing that we've started to do to address that across the company is actually the spike. So we've started to formalize, we're going to write a ticket just for doing a spike. It's kind of like a design sprint, I guess. But it's a time-boxed period of exploration where the idea is that you generate those questions. You try and figure out what you don't know about the problem. You document the questions that you've asked. You try and drive to some answers. And the output of the spike is actually a set of next steps that you can use to create additional tickets and work. So you're using the spike process to try and fill out small segments of the circular workflow that feel more linear. And that's what we do next.
Hello, my name is Warren. I guess you can't see me because it's very dark here. I'm from Berlin, so it's 9:30 here. In our organization, we have domain owners. These are usually like very senior analysts. And when there's a circular project, like for example, recently there was a question like how users navigate in our web page, which basically you can get your retirement trying to answer that question. And in that case, usually we, like the domain owner, senior analyst, pair up with like more junior analysts, like if they are like assigned to that ticket, and we try to break down those like huge questions into like small doable components, and then try to tackle them in our, like, it's not really sprints, but in our 2 weekly sprint-like cycles. This is how we usually try to manage those circular projects.
That makes a lot of sense. That reminds me of Katie's minimum viable insight. And that's a strategy we take a lot too. If it's a very sort of curiosity-driven project, we'll ask the stakeholders, what are your biggest curiosities? If you were going to prioritize, I want to know the most about this, which order would that go in? And so if you can tackle that one question or some things in the direction of that question in a week or in a 2-week period, depending on how your sprints are running, that's still a win, even if you say there's a ton we don't know in terms of that like relationship management and trust building with the data team for when the really hard conversations come. That's really nice to have. I'm here for the strategies. Everybody shared really nice stuff so far.
Yeah, that was really helpful, because I think I still had, maybe my engineer hat on too much, and I was thinking it was either or, like, linear is kind of more traditional and circular is going to be like a spike. But yeah, I really like that minimum viable insight. I was writing it in my notebook and starring it in big letters. So yeah, this was great.
We have a win. We have a win. Very excited.
Hey, I had a piggyback question off of this. So I'm Favian. I'm a senior analyst at a small company called Summer, where we're building software for student loans. And one thing that I have been struggling with lately is, like, how do we kind of, like, in terms of actually communicating these plans out, we sort of use a ticketing system like you would in Agile, or I guess even Kanban. And it's like, what would a ticketing system look like in this circular paradigm, I guess? Like, I understand, like, oh, maybe you have a ticket for your MVP. And then, but is a ticketing system the best way to kind of go about communicating an ongoing effort for this circular system? Or have people had success with, like, a parallel system as well? Like, I feel like I've kind of heard the answer that, like, you can sort of fit it into the, like, Agile sort of ticketing type system, but, like, is there, like, are there any other ways to go about it? For example, one of my teammates was telling me, like, oh, what would be helpful is, like, if we had, like, just for the circular type stuff, more just like we have a running doc where we're kind of just working through it. And then for, like, the linear things, we keep those in the kind of more Agile framework. So is that something that any of you have thought about?
One thing I've done in the past is as part of sprint planning. So this is when I was running a team that had a mixture of very more engineering-y machine learning projects as well as very open-ended research stuff. Is one thing we figured out kind of at the beginning of the sprint is, like, how much of our time overall are we dedicating towards different types of work? Like, how much time are we devoted towards, coding machine learning systems? How much are we devoted to research? How many devoted to, like, other categories of things? And that was just a nice, like, framing for the sprint as a whole, where then we could go, like, of the, number of person days that we have allocated towards estimable work, we'll go and do that estimation and slot together a sprint. And we didn't even bother it with the rest. We just identified that as, like, other stuff we're doing this week or these next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I do think it depends on what you're using your ticketing system for. Because, like, I know a lot of my team stakeholders we're in Jira, they don't actually look at Jira. Jira is a lot more for my purposes as a manager to, like, understand what people are spending their time on, to track velocity, just to get a better idea of where time is going, like Harlan was saying. And, like, in terms of, like, communicating out with stakeholders, then we might have, like, a wiki or a running doc or something that's a bit more digestible. But in terms of even just connecting sequential linear things that end up being a circle, like, you can link tickets, you can connect them somehow. I don't think it's impossible to have a circular project tracked in a ticketing system. It's just a matter of what the ticketing system is being used for.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, in former line of work, I was a scientist and spent a lot of time on open-ended questions and pretty much all circular tasks all the time. And, I didn't learn anything about Agile or managing a ticket for a ticket queue for work until I started working for a technology company. And, back then, when it was all circular tasks, or all felt like circular tasks, notebooks, both the physical sort of lab notebooks, where literally I would be just taking a running log of notes, thoughts, data collected, and then step back later to sort of synthesize all of that, and also sort of actual, code notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, or R&D files, where you're just doing a lot more of the sort of exploratory data analysis. I think the important thing is to time box yourself in a, when you're actually working in a side of a company and expected to come up with sort of deliverables or get back to your stakeholders. You do need to time box that stuff, but I think that there is like, room to go off and do that sort of deeper, more circular work in these open-ended frameworks. And the ticket for that kind of work is just like, I'm gonna, the deliverable is actually sort of to the team or to that person themselves as the internal stakeholder of saying, I'm going to have some thoughts jotted down, have some preliminary analyses that I can actually digest and put into a doc and summarize for the team or summarize for my stakeholders to get sort of feedback and next steps when I emerge back out from that circular process.
I think writing down the goals is a really useful role of a ticketing system for more open-ended projects. And from a sort of your portfolio of communication methods that you're using to help the team work, to help stakeholders know what's happening. When I've worked in more product aligned ways as a data team member, I might just share in that product's Slack channel, like, hey, we're working on this big research project. Here are 3 interesting insights that came out of that this week. And sometimes you'll get stuff like, ooh, you're using that naming column, but we don't use that anymore because of whatever, or wow, that's really interesting, and I just had a conversation about it. So it kind of fosters that good communication flow. And we're also, in the way that I work at my current job, we use written sprint updates a lot. So a ticketing system can't do everything. It's a little bit more granular, I think, than sometimes the higher level perspective that certain stakeholders are looking for. But yeah, I think they have a role. Other questions or curiosities?
So one of the things that makes a circular task circular is that risk of failure and the fact that like it just might not be possible. It's not that the results might surprise you or that it's going to be harder than you thought or anything like that, but it might just not be feasible with kind of the methods and data you have available. I would love to kind of hear from folks how they manage that internally, whether that's sort of how you communicate a specific failure or how you communicate about failure as your team, and things like that would be great.
That's huge. I say it starts at scoping where you can on the possibility of failure, but I mean, besides that, it's as early as possible, but that's easier said than done because I don't know, sometimes you can like slide into failure. You don't realize like, oh, this is not going in the right direction. Like, when do you take that step back? And I don't know if there's an isolated incident that can make it perfect, or like that's a great way for it to come out. But that seems like one of those reasons why it's nice to have had some wins. To have kind of built up that trust as you go along. Because I don't know if there's an easy way to really soften the blow of this didn't turn out the way we expected, but having that relationship to build on seems really important in those situations. How are other people thinking about that or handling it?
I think, yeah, communication, especially in the context of like just managing expectations. We were talking about junior analysts earlier, but to some degree, it's also about not even necessarily junior stakeholders who you're working with, but just people like less accustomed to this sort of work and the data research process, which can be a very senior person or very experienced leader within the company that just hasn't had a lot of this going on, or comes from a company that didn't have a data team or something like that. I think managing expectations early on and kind of prevents that sort of, I feel like it's also discussed, kind of parallel concept of the centralized data team versus the embedded data teams within parts of a business that, your stakeholders can often see a centralized data team that, iterates on a circular project and comes back empty-handed as like, well, they're just off, in the tower and researching and, really trying to communicate as best you can with the stakeholders to avoid, sliding into that kind of trap, like you were saying.
Yeah, I think another piece of that is communicating what the failure modes are. Like it might be that you don't know if the analysis is possible because you've never looked at that data before. It might be that like you don't know if there is actually a trend in there, and the way you handle those is really different. Because if it's like we've never worked with this before, it's a lot easier to set the expectation up front and just say like, yeah, I mean, we don't know what this looks like. It might be really unusable. So give us a chance to estimate whether this is even possible to start. And then if you go and you do an analysis and nothing pans out, that's a lot more awkward to deal with. But that's a situation where hopefully if you're doing that, it's something you have some context for because you have a relationship with the person asking for it, or you've worked with the data in some capacity. And hopefully the strength of your relationship can save you a bit there. Like I've had this happen with my team where we've gone off and investigated something that seemed like it was going to be a great opportunity, and it turned out that it was actually like not important or interesting at all. And fortunately, because we had a good relationship with the person who asked for it, they were like, I see. Okay, well, it's better to know this than not know it and invest a ton of effort into building something around this idea. So even though there was like not something exciting there and it turned out there was nothing, it actually ended up being okay.
You remind me.
Like that idea. Oh, sorry. I really like that idea.
We're all so excited.
Taking learnings from it. Like, it's not that we failed. This is what we learned. This doesn't matter. Or this isn't viable. And this is, it's work that you'll never do again. It's, it's like you're still moving the company in the right direction. You're focusing, you can celebrate it for what it is rather than considering it failure.
Yeah, thinking about it as a positioning thing is that's a better summary than what I said, which was quite rambling.
Yeah, I'll echo what everyone else has said. Hi, I'm Harold. I'm a data science manager at Lyft. One thing I want to echo what everyone's saying is that at Lyft, we have a culture of valuing learnings just as much as impact. So just making that clear across the board that even if something fails, we take as much learnings as possible to inform next steps is almost just as good as like delivering something that has a win. So that's something that we keep emphasizing. And I think that's a good way to sort of like reframe the problem of like when something circular doesn't pan out, what to do next. So I agree with everyone here.
Important follow-up question. How do you get product managers to agree to that, where learnings are equal to impact?
For sure. I think for our culture, I think the learning versus impact type of culture is permeated across like product and engineering. So we have sort of leadership support on that. One of the things that I think we do quite well is just sharing information across the company as well. So for instance, for any experiment that happens, even though Lyft is like a very big company, that experimentation update, like email listserv is pretty much to the entire company. So that itself, just by reporting like what worked and what didn't work, just has tremendous value across the whole organization. So again, I don't really have a good answer for that. It just started like from the top, and I think that's where people sort of get aligned.
I think a good partner strategy for that is also if there's a way to say what we actually need for a thing to happen, like, we need to record this data. Sometimes that can be nice to come in and say as well. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. I'll say this problem isn't a data problem. There are just things we can't know about people because they're not recordable. So kind of giving that extra context and not assuming that people are thinking about it the same way, but also if it's as easy as, well, just at least give us this JSON object of the event so we can sort of do something, even if there's not enough engineering time to get, this exact field. Sometimes it's that, and so people feel like looking for those yes and moments, as it were, can be a really helpful way of dealing with failure too. That's a really what's the word? Provocative place to start, Caleb. That was a good question. Teamwork.
The point about like this is not even possible with data is interesting.
Important.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And I do think, like, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but like some circular workflows are initiated by, like someone asks something that's not really possible with data, but you're like, oh, maybe we can approximate it. And then you just end up getting trapped. just not do it.
We have really strong like qualitative research teams, and yeah, like you have no data, but maybe you should ask somebody is a thing.
Interesting you say that, because I think Lyft has the opposite problem, which is that everything needs to be backed by data. And there are just certain examples in which you shouldn't stretch like the data capabilities that you have to make a point. And that leads to a situation where some things that are somewhat a little bit more qualitative doesn't get the buy-in that you want. So for instance, just to list an example, let's say we want to improve the feedback system. We need to quantify some sort of impact from improving the feedback system. That's not something that can be directly tied to a metric or dollars necessarily, because there's like multiple order effects that lead to people acting on that feedback and actually driving impact. So that was like one of the examples where we actually set expectations and push back. So it's interesting that different companies have different influences in different ways.
Just as an aside, Harold, just finished this book, How to Measure Anything in Business, which is all about like how to put numbers on something that is not measurable because you haven't done it yet, using sort of expertise combined with like going out and finding data points that you can plug into your analysis. I really strongly recommend it. It sounds really relevant for you folks.
Yeah, I think I've said a number of times to certain teams that I've worked with, like, you know, what is the role of user research in this situation? That's still valuable data. There's a really great article, I can probably find it after this. It's from an ethnographer on why big data needs thick data or something to that effect. And just talking about those, like, just because you can deliver a thing doesn't mean you have the right context, regardless of what data you have around it. So it's a nice read, but I feel like that book is the next step beyond that. So I'm excited to check that out. Something someone said triggered a thought in me, which is sort of getting ahead in circular projects. I found that research briefs can be nice. To the extent that you can have them, if there are things where you're saying, okay, stakeholder, we need to get on the same page, or if there's some domain expert outside of, I used to work in an education company, and so I'd want to talk to the teachers before we started talking about how are we going to investigate this user behavior, because I have good ideas as a person who's been educated, but I mean, they're experts in what they do. So sometimes putting that out there, and yeah, I'm very big on the things this is not solving section. If it needs to be something that is solving, we talk about, you know, how is that going to expand the project, or what do we need to know before we can get to that point of iteration? So that kind of pre-work can be a nice tool as well.
Something that's interesting about that is a common part of like software development agile processes is the grooming phase of tickets. And I find that engineering teams typically, like, they're all kind of good at the same types of things, or at least more so. Like the context is shared more than it is on data teams, where you may have a bunch of people who are experts in one particular thing. And like as a manager of a team like that, it can be hard to have as deep of context as the people you're managing. So you can't really groom tickets for people on your team in the same way that an engineering manager can groom tickets for engineers on their team. And I don't know what to do with this information, but that, like, I guess it's like, do you need to include the pre-planning and the grooming as a part of your sprint cycle if you're going to do analytics in a agile setting?
Katie, are you folks like embedded or matrixed? So
we're embedded.
Yeah. So we recently shifted to that, where I, as the manager, have a lot less visibility unless I like super go out of my way to get insight into what's going on. And so, right, I'm not involved with a lot of the particularly smaller project planning types of situations, and then everybody else on the team is engineers and designers or whatever. And yeah, and I think that's maybe part of why I'm thinking a lot about this sort of linear circular thing from the point of view of trying to get more junior data scientists to internalize it and get the right feedback and work on the right things at the right time, if I'm not always there to support. And I think from a centralized team where everybody can kind of chip in and help, estimate, break down, refine questions, things like that.
The kind of like parallel thought too that we've been encountering is that like I feel like there's a lot of there are a lot of project managers who are pretty good analysts in their own right, and the inverse isn't always. I think people end up then assuming that that analysts can be their own project managers a lot more than we often can, my data engineering / analytics team of 2 people, and as we're embarking on learning, getting stricter on agile processes and everything, the grooming phase in particular is where we're like leaning in a lot now, and seeing that whole process, exactly what you're talking about of like, do we, who has all the extra context to make a well-groomed ticket to enable this to neatly fit into a sprint with some kind of estimate around it. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say about it is that I think sometimes analysts will have like this perception of like, what does this PM even do? But one thing that it is important to instill in them is that this is what they need their PM for, is to help them establish business context, in the same way that like their PM is not going to be able to do a good rigorous analysis in the way that they can. They need to work with their PM to understand the product in the business context better.
I think for the work that I do, we end up helping a lot of companies spin up an analytics function for the first time, or to really enhance it. They had a person or a couple of people, but there wasn't necessarily a strategic direction besides get data, do things. So we end up coaching a lot of folks on like, what are your polite ways to say, hey, can you put a ticket on the board so that, I can strategize with my team and get that back up on the back end, or giving folks strategies for digging into the why and the how more so than the what. And those kinds of questions are, what OKR does this match up to? Like, if you could wave a magic wand and have the thing you needed tomorrow, what would that look like? Because, a lot of stakeholders will get into the mode of, this is what I think is possible, or this is what I know is possible, as opposed to, giving you that bigger picture that you can then say, oh, this actually maps up with something else that we're working on. So we can connect the dots. Or, something, if you write SQL, it's like, oh, it's a window function. That's easy. It doesn't take a long time, but they whatever that problem is, if they don't have the technical, necessarily a stakeholder doesn't have the technical context for it. So I think if we're talking agile, that's where that sort of like that retro moment can come in. The retrospectives can be really helpful, and reflecting on, these are tickets that we did really well on scoping, and these are ones that we didn't. Like, what can we take away from, how can we make the next ones better? And sometimes it's, well, we should have said up front, this is, this one was more straightforward, or, we needed more research time for this. And some of it's, I asked X and maybe I should have asked Y, or, hey, teammate, what would you have done in this same situation? And then as teams grow, you can say, hey, partner with that more senior analyst to get a quick gut check on whatever your analysis plan is. The same way I think that some engineering teams work on, this is your architecture plan. Are you using the tool with its strengths and weaknesses in mind? It's my favorite topic. Do you have something, Caitlin? You unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say there was a comment that Baran posted yesterday, asking for sort of what the framework is to start thinking about whether you want a data product manager, whether it would be a good fit for your organization. So I would love to get feedback from other folks if there are those who have worked with a data product manager or thought about it, kind of how you think about that and whether it would in fact streamline some of these issues or not, given the sort of expertise needed and all of that.
I do actually have a data PM at my company, and they do not work with analytics. They work on like warehousing, the experiments tool, stuff like that, like quantifying data quality more so than planning analysis. I don't necessarily know what I think. Like sometimes I feel like I'm like the analytics PM, just in that like I'm more responsible for keeping people on track than most people, just like keeping analysts from going down rabbit holes. And like, I just don't know how a PM could do that, at least on a team like mine, where it's intersecting with so many different areas. Like you just have to know so much to actually have good context. Maybe I'm thinking about it the wrong way, but I feel like PMs work well for linear things. Like circular maybe is something that makes applying a PM to the situation hard.
Yeah, I'd generally echo that, but I actually have worked with a data PM before that did both kind of the data engineering side of things as well as the more analytics type stuff. And what had ended up kind of happening was it was very clear that the data PM was really working more with the data engineering side. And for more the analytics side, I think what we found is we're spending like way too much time just explaining like the context and like just everything that goes behind the actual like all of the business context behind like an actual analytics ask, and like it just felt like duplicative effort. And we kind of just came to this conclusion that like just what makes like a good analytics person is like, and is their ability to deal with that ambiguity on their own and project manage on their own, because it's just there's too much going on for it to become a centralized thing. And so, yeah, like that data PM, for example, we ended up just having them focus on the engineering side.
Yeah, maybe the PM for circular projects is the immediate stakeholder more so than like having it, like maybe for a centralized data science team or analytics team, you would want to have a PM to kind of coordinate some bigger questions you are getting at. But for individual things where it's deeply embedded in a business context, like you don't need one because the stakeholder is doing that work.
Or the stakeholder and the manager, maybe?
Yeah, to the extent that the manager has the context, which they might not always.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like you kind of need both types of context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like as a manager, part of your job is like to help indicate what's feasible and like provide cover fire when the individual analyst or data scientist can't do something, and just make sure to back them up so that their stakeholder isn't thinking that they're just goofing off for no reason.
I'm just feeling a lot of empathy on both sides, you know? Having been the person that the senior or the manager is chasing down, like what's going on? We got to communicate up, and also being able to say, you know, the hardest one phrase that I have practiced over time is, we need to take a look at that and then follow up with you. And resisting the urge in that, like, you know, I think data orgs tend to be very service oriented. So you want to help people, you want to say yes, but being able to take that step back so you can say, oh, this is a project that's gonna take more, or I'm gonna need some cover, I'm gonna need some help figuring it out. Like that's a huge skill. Yeah, I think a little bit of the PM skills to the extent that folks can learn to ask why, you know, like what's really driving it. I think that's really important. I see PM, whatever role someone happens to have. But it's tough. We have tried. We we have had a couple of experiments with data PMs here at my company, and it is tricky to echo. I think that's what you were saying, Fabian, about having that like analytics context. Having switched over into the manager role now for our org, I tend to do more of the data PM stuff because I've touched all the different pieces of kinds of projects that we've worked on in the past. So I can say, okay, this might be possible. We might want to give this one, this many weeks, and you kind of adjust from there and leave and make room for the ICs to just focus on, hey, I think this is the work you need to focus on, or ask a senior to help scope down something specific, as opposed to them having to spend their time doing some of the requirements gathering. But that's a little bit more like a centralized data function than a matrix one. In a matrix one, I think you have to make those spaces for teams to come together and learn from each other. Which, yeah, we're getting away from the PM question, but that's, I think, also pretty useful. And Caitlin, I think you put the data PM, we like them, we want them in the article. Have you had the opportunity to have one before?
No, it's something that for one and I talked about. Yeah, as like, is this the golden ticket? Like you kind of have to. Do you want one? Will it really help? But I've worked with great, very data-minded PMs that have taken on sort of specific projects, and it's worked really well. But it's interesting because it's consistently, and this is kind of the theme I'm hearing, it's someone who has a ton of context and who has been in the org for a long time. And sort of if you aren't coming specifically from an analytics mindset, that context is, and that long history with it is kind of the only other way to start to even wrap your head around what you need to know to be effective.
Yeah. I think the best PM I ever worked with, we just ended up shifting to having monthly sort of high level meetings with him to just say, hey, what are you thinking about from a data perspective, and start to exchange that knowledge so that when data projects came up on the engineering, things that he was coordinating, he could say like, oh, I know that we need to have this kind of conversation or that kind of conversation. So then that's not a data PM specifically, because for the nitty gritty, I mean, I am open-minded to other perspectives, but so far it's been really tough to do it without having had that past experience. But having someone who knows like, oh, these are the little warning bells that I should connect with the data folks for planning this that's a really nice relationship to build as well. We're right in our last 60 seconds here. Should we wrap it up?
I think we're good. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This has been really awesome. It's been a great conversation.
This is great.
Great discussion.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.